while Allied troops feared German machine guns in World War II for their blistering cyclic rates. The Germans in turn feared the raw stopping power of the M2. Browning and its 50 BMG round nicknames like Meat, Chopper, and Kruft didn't arise by accident, and that mutual dread tells only part of the story of how a single cartridge reshaped tactics and equipment across decades. The aftermath of being struck by one of those rounds was often catastrophic, and the weapon's history is rooted in a very practical response to new battlefield realities. To understand why the M2 came to be, you must go back to World War I, when the machine gun transformed from an auxiliary weapon into the centerpiece of modern combat. At that time, most automatic weapons simply fired the same cartridges used by infantry rifles. But the sudden appearance of armored aircraft, armored cars and tanks created an urgent demand for a heavier-hitting ordnance that could reliably disable engines, puncture thin armor, and bring down aircraft. General John Pershing explicitly requested a machine gun capable of defeating those armored threats far more effectively than the contemporary .30 caliber guns. And that brief went to John Browning, the preeminent American firearms designer, whose career had already produced some of the most reliable weapons of the era. Browning was tasked with delivering a design to launch a half-inch projectile at velocities north of 2,700 feet per second, a substantial jump in power and a new engineering challenge. And he met it by scaling up his proven M1917 .30 caliber water-cooled mechanism to handle a much larger cartridge. That cartridge itself was a beefed-up evolution of the .30-06 concept, deliberately rimless for smoother feeding and borrowing lessons from captured German 13.2mm anti-tank rounds. The result was the 50 BMG, or 12.799mm, a round that would prove unusually effective for a machine gun caliber. After iterative prototyping, the initial model entered production as the M1921, a heavy, water-cooled weapon intended primarily for anti-aircraft use. But early testing exposed serious practical problems. Infantry found the gun too bulky to carry in the field. The water-cooled variant weighed around 120 pounds, and the lighter air-cooled model roughly 84 pounds, with the tripod adding another 44 pounds. So a fully deployed ground mount plus ammunition could easily be between 130 and 170 pounds, and the weapon's powerful recoil made accurate sustained fire difficult for small teams. Aircraft and early vehicle mounts also struggled with the gun's size and the original left side only feed. So for a time, the M1921E's role, niche, largely relegated to coastal anti-aircraft emplacements, while its broader battlefield utility remained in question. Browning's death in 1926 didn't end development. Engineers refined his ideas, reworking internal components so feed direction could be swapped quickly by changing the top cover and creating a universal receiver that accepted water-cooled barrels, heavy air-cooled barrels, or lighter aircraft barrels. Those incremental changes transformed the design into what became the M2 Browning, a far more adaptable weapon. While other nations experimented with larger autocannon in 20-13 classes, American doctrine favored the .50 caliber's blend of very high velocity, range, and multi-role flexibility. And production continued a decision vindicated when global conflict returned and the M2E's versatility and power were tested in every theater. Soldiers coined the affectionate and fear-filled nickname Ma Deuce, a contraction of mother and deuce, and the name stuck because the gun's performance often felt maternal in its ruthlessness, protective, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. By the outbreak of World War II, the United States fielded M2s in an astonishing variety of roles: fixed aircraft armament, shipboard anti-aircraft batteries, bomber defensive positions, vehicle mounts, and tripod-mounted infantry configurations, and it proved effective against virtually every target it encountered. Aircraft applications initially demanded lighter barrels and a tuned-up cyclic rate, pushing from roughly 500 rounds per minute to about 1,200 revolutions per minute, so brief firing windows could maximize hit probability. In some aircraft installations, the sheer number of M to S was staggering. The B-17G carried up to 13 in twin mounts across its turrets. The P-47 Thunderbolt packed 8 in its wings, and the Douglas A-26 Invader could be configured with as many as 18 M to S, turning entire aircraft into flying fortresses of 50 caliber fire, compared with the lighter 30 caliber guns common early in the war. The 50 BMG achieved an exceptional balance of rate of fire and single-round destructive power. It could rip through engine blocks, shred airframes, and, with armor-piercing ammunition, punch through aircraft armor and light vehicle plating. When crews brought multiple M2S to bear, the combined effect was devastating to enemy fighters, bombers, and any soft or lightly armored vehicle caught in the open. And that lethality forced changes in both offensive and defensive tactics. American fighters would strafe everything on the move: locomotives, armored cars, and even tanks. Since roof armor was usually thin, and very early in the war, the heavy barrel M2 became a nearly universal fit on tanks, vehicles, and wherever else crews could mount it. By 1945, millions had been made, making the M2 the most produced machine gun in history. And Germans grew increasingly frustrated at how ubiquitous American heavy machine guns were across the battlefield. Low-flying attackers and dive bombers like the Stuka suddenly faced much greater risk because almost every Jeep, half-track, and tank carried a 50. On tanks, the M2 was often fitted to the rear of the turret and fired by a crewman standing on the engine deck so it could be trained up against air attack, a useful arrangement, but one that exposed the gunner outside the relative safety of his vehicle. If you've ever wondered why the Browning's barrel recoils after firing, that's because the M2 works on the short recoil principle. Barrel and bolt begin locked together and move rearward as one to keep the case supported while pressure is still high, so extraction won't rupture the case. After traveling roughly 10 millimeters, the barrel stops and the bolt continues rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent case, compressing the recoil spring, and then being forced forward again to strip the next round from the disintegrating belt. Chamber it and fire, repeating the cycle as long as the trigger is held. The Germans came to hate the 50 for multiple reasons, the clearest being American reliance on overwhelming firepower. U.S. forces rarely ran short of ammunition, and practically anything with wheels or wings now had at least one heavy machine gun. The 50 wasn't just a bigger bullet, it significantly outranged lighter machine guns and delivered between 5 and 10 times more energy than typical infantry weapons. Concrete or brick walls no longer guaranteed safety because rounds could perforate masonry or, with sustained bursts concentrated on a single point, collapse wall sections or shred sandbag emplacements. Even well-armored tanks like the Panzer IV could suffer penetrations to side or rear plates, have optics and tracks disabled, or suffer turret jams from concentrated 50 fire. Lightly armored Japanese tanks in the Pacific were routinely knocked out by 50s, especially during banzai charges when American tankers opened up with everything they had. One controversial wartime claim was that the 50 had been banned by the Geneva Conventions because of its horrific effects on the body. That's a myth. Although the cartridge's destructive potential wasn't exaggerated, a hit from a 50 is frequently catastrophic, either causing death or requiring amputation, and many German soldiers saw those effects firsthand. Given the 50's ability to punch through walls and watermelons alike, the visceral fear it generated was understandable, and German troops adapted by avoiding direct assaults on heavy machine gun positions in favor of snipers, tanks, mortars, and artillery. The Germans had nothing quite like it. Their main heavy automatic weapons were the MG42 or MG34 on the Lafette tripod, which delivered excellent accuracy and range with the 8mm Mauser round, but simply lacked the raw punch of the 50 BMG. Their closest analog was a 13mm heavy machine gun used on fighters. While captured M2s were sometimes pressed into anti-aircraft service, and the Germans even manufactured copies of 50 rounds in a few cases. A sure sign of respect, though actual use was rare. Before looking at some of the more terrifying M2 modifications, it's worth noting the types of ammunition fired. The standard was ball-full metal jacket with considerable destructive power, but there were also specialized variants, multiple armor-piercing types capable of penetrating roughly an inch of hardened steel. Incendiary rounds designed to ignite fuel or other flammables, especially useful against aircraft, and combined armor-piercing incendiary rounds that merge both functions, each making the 50 even more versatile and lethal. Aircraft strafing runs made short work of anything movable: locomotives, armored cars, and even tanks. Since roof and upper deck armor tended to be much thinner, and before long, the heavy barrel M2 became almost ubiquitous on tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and anywhere else crews could fit one, turning the 50 into a ubiquitous symbol of allied firepower across multiple theaters. By 1945, production had climbed into the millions, making the M2 the most produced machine gun in history, and its omnipresence frustrated German forces, who found that low-flying attackers and dive bombers like the Stuka now faced magnified risk because practically every Allied vehicle or emplacement carried a 50. That ubiquity changed how battles were fought, forcing aircrews to adapt approaches and ground commanders to plan around lethal strips of defensive fire. Tank doctrine often placed the M2 on the rear of the turret, with the crewman standing on the engine deck to operate it, allowing quick elevation against air threats, but at the cost of exposing the gunner to small arms and shrapnel. Outside the relative protection of the vehicle, a compromise that highlighted the trade-offs of mounting raw firepower where protection was limited. The M2E's practical utility extended well beyond brute force because its wide palette of ammunition types multiplied roles. Tracer incendiary rounds combined a visible tracer for spotting and adjusting fire with an incendiary element for igniting fuel and flammable targets. And belts were commonly loaded with mixed files, a tracer every fifth round for ground work, while aircraft loaded mission-specific mixes of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer cartridges to maximize lethality in dogfights or ground attacks. Specialized developments amplified the 50's capabilities still further. Multi-purpose Raufoss-style rounds packed an armor-piercing tungsten core with a small explosive and incendiary filler to create fragmentation effects that behaved like a 20mm cannon round in a 50 package. And slap-saboted light armor penetrator rounds used a dense subcaliber penetrator, typically tungsten, to dramatically improve armor penetration, making them surprisingly effective against light armored vehicles and helicopters, though their cost and recoil characteristics generally limited use in sustained automatic fire. The cartridge's versatility also inspired precision adaptations. The sheer power and long-range performance of the 50 BMG led to experiments with telescopic sights on M2 receivers for single-shot extreme range engagements, a tactic famously exploited by sharpshooters decades later, and eventually to purpose-built anti-materiel rifles like the Barrett M82 chambered in 50, which turned the round's ability to disable equipment at long ranges into a new class of specialized firearms. When one heavy machine gun wasn't enough, crews simply multiplied firepower. The M45 Quad 50 mount grouped 4M2S on a single electrically traversed platform to increase volume of fire for mobile air defense, producing on the order of 40 rounds per second, and giving gunners a far better chance to hit fast, low targets. These mounts proved versatile enough to be used for ground support and convoy protection once Allied air superiority reduced the immediate aerial threat, and they continued in service into Korea and Vietnam, sometimes ingeniously mounted on trucks to defend convoys in ambush-prone areas. Being a 50 gunner therefore carried obvious advantages and risks. The distinctive report, smoke and muzzle flash quickly drew enemy attention, and early vehicle mounts often lacked protective shields, leaving crews dangerously exposed until later conflicts drove adoption of armored pintle shields, enclosed turrets, and, ultimately, Remote weapon stations. Modern remote weapon stations let operators fire from the safety of the vehicle interior using joysticks, cameras, laser rangefinders, night vision, and thermal imaging, and accept a variety of weapons, not only the M2, but also medium machine guns and automatic grenade launchers, broadening tactical options while reducing direct exposure. The M2 Browning's arc, from an initially impractical heavy design to a near-universal, century-long service platform, is remarkable. Aside from incremental improvements like the M201E's quicker barrel change system, improved flash suppression, and a manual safety, the core mechanism and cartridge remain essentially the same, proving that a well-executed concept can persist across generations of warfare. Its longevity underscores both the foresight of early designers and the pragmatic value of a powerful, adaptable heavy machine gun that continues to shape tactics, vehicle design, and doctrine with no serious retirement on the horizon.